I'm very pleased to have Chuck Cunningham here again to do a presentation on parent training, evidence-based parenting programs for children with disruptive behavior. Chuck was actually the co-chair with me of the Niagara Conference during the decade that we ran it at Niagara-on-the-Lake. He's a professor, actually he's the Jack Laidlaw Chair in Evidence-Based and Patient-Centered Health at the McMaster School of Medicine, the McMaster Children's Hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. Chuck has been one of the leaders in behavioral parent training for parents of children with disruptive behavior problems. For the last 30 years, he's developed COPE, which is a community-oriented parenting program that can be used in all sorts of settings with kids. He's also developed peer mediation programs for use in school settings for kids who are aggressive on playgrounds, violence prevention and bullying programs in schools, and an assessment tool that's used in half of the country of Canada in mental health settings for assessing, a brief assessment tool for assessing children's mental health problems and tracking progress, not unlike what John was describing in his very interesting program. Please help me welcome Chuck Cunningham.
Okay, my goals for the morning, and I really want to thank John for a terrific introduction to this whole topic, and I'll touch on a number of things that he's discussed in much more eloquent detail than I certainly can. My task is to give you an overview of parent training programs for kids with externalizing problems, and we have enough data now from systematic reviews and meta-analysis to take a look at some of the actual components of these programs. For example, we'll take a look at some of the learning processes that seem to be critical to the success of these programs. Talk about the curriculum, some of the specific skills that have been shown to work in these programs. I'll primarily draw on evidence from systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the type that John has presented. We'll talk a little bit about the effectiveness of parenting programs, or probably more likely the efficacy of parenting programs, some of the training components, including these, some of the curriculum components, the actual skills, and then I'll just mention a couple of promising new directions that are under development now. Let me just say that parenting programs have been evolving for more than 30 years now, and it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these programs have very common roots, and many of them go back to a two-stage program developed by Cunningham at the University of Oregon. And Rex Forehand was one of Cunningham's students. He developed one of the first manualized versions of the program, helping the non-compliant child. Russ Barkley, also a student of Connie's, developed the Defiant Children. Sheila Iberg, who was also at Oregon at the time, developed a very effective program, the Parent-Child Interaction Program. Carolyn Webster Stratton, Incredible Years, shares many of the elements of Connie's program. My own program, the Community Parent Education Program, I was a student of Connie's for 2 years as an intern and a postdoc. More recently, Triple P, a terrific program out of Australia. So there has been an enormous proliferation of variations on parenting programs. And these programs share some important common learning processes. All of these programs typically begin sessions with a homework review, what kinds of things parents have found successful, things they may need additional work on. Almost all employ modeling, either live modeling, demonstrations of strategies, or, as you saw in the Incredible Years programs, videotaped demonstrations of parents using important skills. Many of the programs involve an opportunity for parents to practice skills, either in role-play situations or, more importantly, with their own kids. There are homework goals to set, typically posting reminders around the house. Refrigerator door seems to be a cultural universal for reminders of parenting programs. Monitoring the use of new strategies throughout the day and throughout the week. And then generally supportive learning readings that introduce the principles of social learning theory, that attending to kids showing interest in their activities is actually a reward. Most of these programs also share a common set of strategies that are introduced. Attending strategies, showing interest in what kids are doing. You've got an interesting picture that you've drawn there. Rewards, he did a great job this afternoon. I appreciate you helping out. Planned ignoring, just systematically not responding or getting involved in arguments with kids. Saw some good examples of that in Carolyn Webster Stratton's tapes. Giving effective commands, transitional strategies. In 5 minutes, it'll be time to get ready for bed. When you've got your room cleaned up, then you can get on the internet. Planning and problem solving. Contracting and point systems, daily report cards are often effective in teaching kids strategies, motivating kids, linking schools to parent training programs, and then timeout. So these programs, though they have different names, rely on a set of strategies for teaching skills, and in fact teach many of the very same systematic skills. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and the studies that I'm going to talk about are drawn from systematic reviews of the literature, none quite as comprehensive as the work that John is doing, but a good start. So systematic reviews or meta-analyses start with a systematic review of the electronic databases that are available. They're backed up by a search of unpublished or gray literature, dissertations, articles that were not accepted for publication that may have involved a trial. There are formal inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then they're coded objectively according to standard criteria, typically by 2 or 3 coders who actually analyze the study. Systematic reviews may go on to a meta-analysis. John presented a lot of meta-analytic data. I'll show you some additional meta-analytic data on parent training. They often include an effort to determine whether or not the quality methodologically of the study is a moderator of outcome. It often is. Effect size estimates, and then moderator analyses. And an interesting set of analyses, fail-safe or file draw statistics, take a look at how many non-significant trials would you have to find in people's file cabinets that weren't published to overturn the results of the systematic review or the meta-analysis. Now, let me just say that effect size calculation is a mysterious and difficult thing. There are many, many different ways that effect sizes are calculated. Most of the studies that I'm going to present used a simple formula here, but not all. So keep that in mind, that the effect sizes that appear in different systematic reviews may vary as a function of the type of analysis that was done. And as John pointed out, point 2 is classically considered a small but significant effect, point 5 a moderate effect, and point 8 a large effect. Now, when we think about parenting programs, most of the work that's available might be considered efficacy studies. These are studies conducted under optimal conditions, randomized trials, with highly trained leaders who work according to manuals and are typically checked to ensure that they're delivering the program with integrity. We have fewer effectiveness studies in the parent training area. This is actually programs done by frontline clinicians in clinics with the kinds of heterogeneous cases that John talked about. And we have even fewer studies that look at an absolutely critical factor in service delivery, and that's the cost or an economic analysis. Now, most of the studies that have been done have used a multiple set of measures. A parent report is probably the most common observational measure that's used. There are direct observations. Those can be done in the home or in the clinic. And most studies use a combination of these measures. One of the findings in the field, I think, is if we take a look at the effect sizes for the reports of parents who have participated in these programs, who of course are not blind, versus direct observations of the skills that they've acquired, we see something like this. So there are fairly strong effect sizes for parent reports. There are lower effect sizes for direct observation. So parents typically are a bit more optimistic than independent observers might be as to the outcome of these studies. One of the things that John talked about was the extent to which programs have effects that go beyond the focus or the target of the program. So the target of these parenting programs is typically externalizing problems, oppositional disorders, conduct problems, and ADHD, but typically studies measure a broader range. And so there fairly good evidence that there are small to moderate effects on parent knowledge and small to moderate effects on parents' sense of self-efficacy. So parents who have gone through these programs report improvements. Those improvements are backed up with direct observations, but parents are also a bit more knowledgeable and more confident in their skills after participating in parenting programs. I think one of the most interesting findings in the field is we've focused typically on externalizing outcomes in these studies, but as John pointed out, most of the kids who come with comorbid disorders. They often have ADHD or oppositional disorders, but they may also be anxious or, as they get older, depressed. And one of the interesting questions is to see, do these programs benefit not only externalizing problems, but other internalizing problems? And so here you can see the effect in this particular analysis is small on externalizing programs, but actually large on small to moderate for internalizing problems. So there's good evidence that these programs have broader effects than just the externalizing problems for which they were designed. And as we take a look at the components of these programs, you can see why, in fact, that might be true. File drawer analysis, these are two systematic reviews, and again, this is the unpublished, non-significant results that would have to exist to overturn the results of a meta-analysis. And keep in mind that unfortunately in the field we have a tendency to favor randomized trials that have significant outcomes. If you run a randomized trial, even if it's well executed and the differences are not significant, it's probably more difficult to get it published. And so systematic reviews typically try to track down as many of those non-published trials as possible. So two systematic reviews, and one done by Mon in 2005, an earlier one, would take about 51 non-significant unpublished studies to overturn the results of their meta-analysis. A more recent one in the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology by Kaminsky, a terrific paper, I would recommend it highly. It would take about 250 non-significant unpublished papers to overturn the results of that systematic review and meta-analysis. So these are fairly solid findings. Now, one of the things I think that's interesting from these meta-analyses and systematic reviews is there are enough of them now that we can start to take a look not just at packages of parenting programs that I described earlier, but what the component skills that seem to make these programs work might be. And one of the key strategies that's used in virtually all parenting programs, again, are live demonstrations or video modeling, as John showed earlier. And this is a review of studies that didn't include modeling versus those that did. So the effect size for those that didn't include modeling was 0.16, quite small. The effect size for those that included modeling was 0.39. So modeling looks like from this analysis to be one of the critical ingredients in parent training. And if you think about it from a social learning perspective, we really learn what we see. We're observers, and it's one of the most effective teaching strategies that we have available. Another one that a lot of programs include is the opportunity to practice skills with your own child. And there have been enough of those now that we can take a look at trials that didn't include the opportunity to practice versus trials that did. And the effect size in this analysis for those without practice is 0.33. The effect size for those that include practice with a child are 0.191. So this is probably one of the more important active ingredients in parent training programs. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The actual opportunity to practice new skills with your child, the opportunity for therapists to give parents feedback, a nice job of using a win-then strategy, and the sense of accomplishment and success that parents get in actually trying strategies is an important teaching component. So those programs, and this was an original ingredient in Connie Hamp's programs, and in many of those that have evolved from it, the opportunity to practice with kids would seem to be a critical element in the success of these programs. This is the effect of practice with your own child on externalizing problems. The previous slide was on parenting skills, so no practice, and again, an opportunity to practice with a child. So this is an important skill-building strategy that's common to many, not all, parent training programs. Most programs involve homework, and certainly we stress to parents that this is really critical. There's enough data around now to actually see whether we were right or not, so these are trials that included no homework versus those that did. 0.39 with no homework, about 0.38 with homework. Suggests to me that most of the learning in a parent training program takes place during the session, during modeling, during opportunities to practice with kids. And the inclusion of homework or not didn't seem to be associated with a benefit. Now this is a really interesting slide, and like some of the studies that John suggested, he wasn't sure how to interpret. This would be one for me. And this is an analysis that looked at the number of sessions that were included in various parenting interventions. So 1 to 5 sessions, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, and 16 plus. And most parent training programs are somewhere in the order of 10 to 15 sessions. So there is a very large effect with studies that were short, a bit smaller with studies that were longer, a bit smaller again with longer studies again, and very small for very long studies. Now, these are not randomized trials, randomizing people to different durations, but they do suggest something interesting, as some of the parents who are most difficult to engage and most difficult to sustain in a program have the most difficult kids. And some of the key strategies in parent training programs are positioned towards the end of the program. So parents who may drop out early in the process may in fact miss some of the really critical ingredients. So I don't know the mechanisms here, and this is something really to pursue, but it does suggest that more is not necessarily better when it comes to parent training. And this is not an orphan finding. This has been seen in systematic reviews of interventions in other areas. I think one of the things that those of us who have spent our career doing parent training struggle with is how to get dads more involved. And some of Bill's colleagues, Greg Fabiano, has done some terrific work on designing parent programs that are a little bit closer to the interests of dads. But there are enough studies around now that we can ask whether or not the effort to include fathers is critical to the success of parenting programs. So this is the impact on parenting skills for fathers versus mothers. Dads often feel that, well, you know, I don't need this. This is not something, I don't have as much difficulty. And there's some evidence to suggest that. So the effect sizes for mothers about 0.84 in this analysis, and for fathers about 0.53 to 0.49 at post and follow-up. So dads don't show as much skill development in parenting programs as their wives do. This is reported impact on child behavior by mothers and fathers. So moms report fairly strong effect sizes in this analysis, fathers a little bit less. This is impact on child behavior, post and follow-up for projects that used mothers only or mothers plus fathers. And here you can see at post-test that there seems to be a benefit associated with father's involvement. Makes sense. At follow-up, it's not significant any longer. Impact on parent perceptions, programs with mothers only, mothers plus fathers. At follow-up, it's gone. So that's not statistically significant. I think, by and large, I would conclude that it's probably a good idea to try and involve fathers, but not absolutely critical. Now, what about the actual strategies that we introduce in parenting programs? One of the core features of Cunningham's original two-stage program is an emphasis on relationship building skills. And the first part of the program in those days was called Child's Game. And it was an effort to rebuild relationships between parents and kids, which have often deteriorated over a number of years prior to parent training. So one of the strategies that was looked at in some of the systematic reviews was positive interaction. So showing interest in kids' activities, watching what they're doing, describing their activities, enthusiastically interacting with them would be examples of positive interactions. And these are studies which didn't include that as a focus versus those which did. So very small effects for those that didn't, much larger effects for those that did. So that component of relationship building skills seems to be a critical part of parent training programs. A lot of programs also go beyond that and focus on what attachment theorists might be particularly interested in. And this is really sensitive responding to kids, nurturing behavior, supportive physical interaction, and so forth. And there are a number of programs that have focused on that and a number that have not. So the effect sizes for those that didn't include that emphasis on sensitive responding are relatively small, substantially larger for those that focused on responsiveness. So one of the core ingredients in programs for kids with externalizing problems seems to be that systematic building of relationships. And that may be one of the reasons these programs seem to have beneficial effects for kids with internalizing problems as well. You saw a nice example of timeout. My sympathies for that parent who was trying to execute that. Core ingredient in a lot of parenting programs, but not all. So this analysis looking at programs that did not include timeout versus those that did. So timeout seems to be a critical part of a good parenting program. And so if you think about it, in Cunningham's original program, the first half of the program was called Child's Game. It was a relationship building part. The second half was called Parents' Game, and that focused on encouraging compliance and encouraging cooperation, and if necessary, using time up as a backup strategy. And these analyses would suggest that both the relationship building and the control strategies that are introduced in parenting programs are critical to their success. One of the things that I think all of us who have done parent training recognize is that kids whose parents come to parent training often have a lot of other difficulties, and it's tempting to expand the program to focus on a broader range of skills. And there are a number of programs that, in addition to attempting to improve parenting skills, have also added an emphasis on social skills. So these are programs that didn't include a focus on social skills and those that did. How many of you think that including a social skills emphasis would improve the outcome of parenting programs? Makes a lot of sense. So there are the effect sizes for programs without a social skills component, and there are the effect sizes for programs with a social skills component. Now that sort of may seem counterintuitive, but it's not the only finding that suggests that expanding parenting programs to focus on a broader range of issues may not in the long term be the best way to go. Now, let me just say that there are some terrific examples of programs where that has not been the outcome, and one is the Incredible Years program. So the Incredible Years program has conducted trials looking at the inclusion of Dinosaur schools, and Dinosaur Skills has 22 small group kids sessions, interactive videotape modelings, 100 different vignettes that focus on social skills, empathy, anger management, cooperation at home and school. And there are role-playing opportunities and problem-solving with puppets. How many of you have seen examples of that? It's a really engaging, well-designed program. And of course, there are homework exercises for kids to take those strategies home and apply them. And so this was an early randomized trial that asked the question whether the inclusion of that child training improved the outcome of parenting programs. So this is looking at child behavior checklist total problem scores. So here are the pre-test scores, these are T-scores, and the post-test scores for parent training alone and a follow-up. Here are the pre-test scores and post-test scores and follow-ups for a version of the program including Dinosaur School, and here are the control. So you can see it kind of looks like just at least on main outcome measures it didn't increment effects, but actually, if you follow it up, there's a bit more interesting story here. So this is using a recovery measure, the percentage of parents that evidenced clinically significant improvement, and that was defined in this study as a 30% decrease in total child deviant behavior score at home. And so this is the percentage clinically improved who just got parent training, child training alone, or parent plus child training. So there is some evidence from these studies that a well-designed social skills program as part of a parent training program can successfully broaden the impact of those programs. So I think the jury's still out on that issue. Now, as John pointed out, a lot of parents who come to parent training programs come with a lot of other issues, and it's tempting to try and deal with these as a part of parent training programs. And so one of the things that was looked at in one of the systematic reviews was what are the advantages of focusing on some of these other difficulties that often prevent parents from making progress in parent training programs: anger management, dealing with case management issues, and so forth. And so these are studies that did and did not include a focus on some of these other issues. So 0.6, a large effect size for those programs that didn't include that additional focus. They strictly focused on parent training skills, and those that did. So like social skills training, as you broaden out a parent training program, there's a little bit of evidence that you may lose the impact that you see at least on externalizing problems. This is the effect of ancillary services on externalizing problems, the same kind of a phenomenon. So there's a little bit of evidence that a broader program isn't necessarily more effective. Okay, now some of the limitations of parent training programs that I think are important. How many of you have actually done parent training or struggled with that? Okay, so these should not be a surprise, but these are some of the risk factors. And one of the problems in parent training is that the factors that put kids at risk are the same factors that lead to dropouts or poor outcomes. So for example, poorer parents now these are different kind of effect sizes. This is the strength of the association between this risk factor and poor outcome. So parents who are poor, low-income families tend to do more poorly in parent training programs. Parents who deal with a lot of barriers, transportation, childcare, and so forth, often do more poorly in parent training. Parents with large families, lots of kids, have a more difficult time, and to some extent, parents who are single parents. So the risk factors that put kids at risk also make it difficult to work. So some of the highest risk parents are some of the most difficult to engage. Maternal psychopathology is a big predictor. We know from some of Sonia Bark's studies in England that parents who themselves have symptoms of ADHD don't seem to benefit from parent training. So parent psychopathology is a limiting factor. Parent education, parents who are more poorly educated do worse in parent training. Parents who are depressed have a more difficult time in parent training. Yet, on the other hand, there are a fair number of trials of parenting programs that suggest that improvements in parenting skills and reductions in behavior problems are associated with a reduction in parent training. Matt Sanders of the Triple P program has sometimes said that parent training is the treatment of choice for mothers who are depressed. And just stress. So again, some of the family risk factors, some of the individual parent risk factors that put kids at risk, limit the outcome of parenting programs. Just as an example, this was a study that we did years ago, taking a look at why parents didn't take advantage of a parenting program that was universally available in their schools. And one of the most frequent factors was the time of the session simply didn't fit into their work or schedule. They were just too busy, shift work, difficulties organizing childcare on a weekly basis, or transportation difficulties. And so Kasdan has shown us there are a lot of simple logistical factors that make it difficult for parents to engage in the kinds of weekly parenting programs that we're talking about here. Now, this is a series of studies that we've been involved in more recently that use methods that come out of marketing research, and transportation economics, and health economics that look at the preferences of users. And these are choice methods. We present people with variations of different combinations of in these cases, parenting program attributes. And one of the things that we do in this analysis is a latent class segmentation analysis. And it just assumes that there are clusters of parents who have very different preferences about the way services should be designed. And these are three segments that we see emerging in a number of our studies. One we call an action segment. These are parents who want to get started right now on solutions to their kids' difficulties. They're not particularly concerned about logistical issues. They don't worry about the duration of the program. They're willing to put the time and effort into that. A group of information-oriented parents that seem to be more passive. They want to understand the kinds of difficulties their kids are having, but they're not prepared to begin working on the kinds of step-by-step solutions that we see in parenting programs. Or an overwhelmed segment of parents, a group of parents who are more depressed, who simply say, I just haven't got the time and energy to pursue it at this point in time. These are called utility values. Economists use these to, in a sense, estimate the relative value of different components of a product or service to different segments of parents. And so these are the utilities associated with different ways that parenting programs might be delivered. So, for example, a parenting program could be delivered individually. Parent pursues it alone. It could be done as a part of a parenting group. Make a lot of sense. You think that support and networking would be critical to the success of a program. Could be done alone with coaching. There's some examples of distance programs. I'll show you an example of one of those a bit later. Or it could be a combination of a parenting group with some individual coaching for parents. And these are the utilities associated with those options. And this is that overwhelmed group of parents. And they simply, maybe they'll pursue it individually, but they're not the least bit interested in groups or any variation of those. This is that passive group of parents, the information-oriented parents. And again, they have a strong preference for individual services. They avoid coming out to groups with other parents. That action-oriented group, not surprisingly, like to pursue with groups. They want as much coaching and help as they can possibly get. So a majority of the parents in these studies are not interested in participating in group interventions. And we see this in a whole series of studies recently, that parents are uncomfortable with the idea of going out to a group and meeting a bunch of people that they're unfamiliar with. Once they have a chance to participate in a group, they typically love it. But there's a hesitancy to participate in groups that we think may contribute to a fair number of parents simply not taking advantage of these kinds of interventions as we've configured them. Just as a kind of an example of that, keep in mind that number of around 40% of those parents who seem to be interested in groups. These are three prospective utilization studies. These are studies where the research teams screened large populations of parents, didn't wait for parents to be referred to a clinic, and then offered parenting services and looked at uptake. So prospective utilization studies. So an early one that we did, about 40% of parents who had moderately severe problems and about 50% whose kids had more severe problems took advantage of a parent training program. This is a much larger study in 2000, 28% of the moderate, 46% of the severe. And this is a study by Russ Barkley around about the same time, finding very similar findings. So one of the things, if we back up and look at the prospective utilization of parenting interventions, it's not a majority of parents who are probably engaging in those. So we've designed interventions that work very effectively, I think the evidence would show, with a subset of parents, but there may well be a larger group of parents who don't take advantage of these. Now, this is another study. This is a study, again, of the preferences of a sample of over 1,000 parents seeking children's mental health services. This data analysis is just in preparation. And this looks at 3 different delivery vehicles. Services could be delivered over the internet. They could be delivered via email. There are some really interesting health promotion interventions that are delivered in that way. They could be done via phone, or it could be done in a more traditional face-to-face way. And there are 3 segments here. This, again, is that action segment, and they show a strong preference for traditional face-to-face parenting interventions, like a parenting group. But here's another large segment that actually has a slight preference for telephone-delivered interventions, possible distance interventions. And a third segment that, again, has a preference for phone contact. So here's actually a majority of a sample of 1,000 parents seeking children's mental health services who respond favorably to the idea of a distance intervention rather than traditional face-to-face groups that we've conducted. So here's an interesting trial of that delivery vehicle. This is a study of a variation of the Triple P program. It was done with groups of 69 families of preschoolers in Germany. They used Triple P's 10-chapter parenting book, German translation, videos demonstrating parenting skills, and they were called by a conversational facilitator, a coach we sometimes refer to them as, who helped parents work through the lessons, helped them solve problems, provided support and encouragement. So this is a distance program done at home with support from a telephone coach. And these are the results of that trial. So the control group in that trial, this is a randomized trial, very small effect size. And this is the effects of a distance program with telephone coaching. So there are some alternate delivery vehicles that people are starting to explore, which I think may reach a group of parents that are probably not being successfully engaged in the kinds of parenting programs that we've been talking about this morning. This is just, again, going back to that question of do these programs have broader effects beyond just externalizing problems. So this was the impact of that telephone-supported distance program on internalizing problems. So the control group, and again, a moderate effect on internalizing problems. So again, I suspect that these programs have broader effects than the externalizing difficulties for which they were designed. Now, John pointed up some of these caveats, but I just want to touch on them again. Some limitations of systematic reviews is these are not experimental manipulations. These are not randomized trials. These are correlational analysis. If it looks like some of these components are critical, they really need to be subjected to a randomized trial. And most of the reviews that I've talked about today have focused on parents of relatively young kids with externalizing problems. There are far fewer studies of the more difficult kinds of adolescents that are treated successfully in the MST programs that John mentioned earlier this morning. Okay, well, some conclusions that we could draw from this data. I think it's fair to say from a large number of studies that have been conducted that parent training programs are effective for externalizing problems. I think it's promising that the effects of parent training programs are much broader than the externalizing problems for which they were originally designed. I think there's some interesting data suggest that more focused programs may be more effective than broader programs that try to accomplish a lot. It may be that focusing on social skills, focusing on other parenting difficulties distracts parents and therapists from the core skills that are key to the success of parenting programs. It's clear that family and parent risk factors moderate the outcome of parenting programs. These programs are not as successful with higher risk families, the families that are often seen in frontline clinics. I think it's clear from the few prospective utilization studies that have been done is that many parents don't use the available parent training options. I think it's fair to say that fathers provide some benefit, at least at the short term, to the outcome of parenting programs. And I think it's clear from some of the more recent consumer preference modeling approaches that design factors influence the utilization of these programs. We really need to pay a lot more attention to the service preferences of the parents that we're trying to enroll in these programs. And there are some new delivery modes. Telephone-based programming is an example. We're involved in some trials of smart internet versions of these programs. These are programs which may reduce barriers for some of the parents that we're not successful in engaging currently. Thank you.